Thank you very much for waiting. Thank you for joining us at today's symposium, Unleashing Japan's Significant Offshore Wind Potential. I will serve as the moderator from the Renewable Energy Institute. I am Obayashi. At the Renewable Energy Institute, I am the director. The institute, in the last few years, we are strongly focusing on projects related to offshore wind, and as part of that, we have decided to organize this international event. On the 1st of June, IEA has released a new report. According to the report, expansion of renewables is finally accelerating, and 330 gigawatt was last year, and going beyond that, 440 gigawatt is expected this year, and next year, 550 gigawatt and beyond is the forecast. And solar will also be expanded, which is the largest, but for this year, wind energy. In the last few years, it was a bit flat, but it is reviving, and more than 100 gigawatt of increment of wind for this year is expected, which is a massive speed. According to IEA report, this year and next year, they are looking at these years. So for about offshore, at least for this year and next year, it is not going to be as large as last year. However, as you know, last year, many countries, including Western economies, started to set up a new goal to expand offshore. As you know, Germany by 2030, 30 gigawatt, the UK 50 gigawatt, and out of that 5 gigawatt will be floating, which is a very ambitious British target. By the end of last year, the Maritime Renewable Alliance, OLIAC, according to this forecast, by 2050, 1,400 gigawatt of offshore wind potentially could be developed across the world. So these are all ambitious goals, and expansions are implemented, and as generation should start by 2030, there is only 7 years left, but the foundation to expand offshore wind, many countries are trying to expand the foundation, and there is a competition. In the last 20 years, those who have worked on offshore, the Europeans have gone ahead, and Asia is trying to catch up. Going forward, in the next few years, the transmission, port and harbor supply chain, and human resources, these are all indispensable factors essential for wind potential, and this is now the era of global competition. Of course, there are advanced international companies, and their knowledge must be learned and promote technical transfer. At the same time, with a view to 10 years from now, 20 years from now, for the domestic industry to develop, new knowledge and wisdom are required. In the case of Japan, the Public and Private Council announced in 2020 the first offshore wind industrial vision by 2040 at a maximum 45 gigawatt of project formation was included in Japan's goal. However, as I mentioned at the outset, all over the world, in the last few years, there is an accelerated expansion of renewables. In addition to that, considering the crisis of energy, although it is project formation, 40 gigawatt, is that enough as the goal of Japan, is the question. In fact, for the practitioners working on offshore wind, a 45 gigawatt of project formation, and possibly Japan will not even achieve this modest goal in the first place. Even as of today, Japan has not started the policy, which is MSP, Marine Spatial Planning. maritime spatial planning called MSP, Japan does not have a clear plan. So to develop offshore wind, for example, locationing of the wind farm, about how to use the ocean space, the policies, Japan does not have a clear plan about the maritime environment and about other stakeholders. There must be coordination or a permitting procedure, simplification of regulations, or procedures for location. MSP will be required for all these. In order to promote offshore, appropriate regulations and criteria need to be developed, and the different requirements by all stakeholders and restrictions can be coordinated. In the case of Japan, there is an overwhelming delay in human resources cultivation. For the time being, as I mentioned, there are international manufacturers. By joint development, technology might be transferred. But in order to support domestic industry, we need engineering workers, constructors. We also need a policy knowledge, human resources. We need legal personnel, how to acquire financing, technical expertise is sufficient, education training program are inadequate. In response to industry growth, there must be increasing human resources cultivation, which are not taking place. So only just a few. There are so many challenges, so many homeworks that we have to fulfill going forward. According to IEA, Japan's offshore wind potential says it is larger by 9% compared to Japan's current demand. Japan has this massive demand. In order to change this into a reality, as I mentioned, so it is 9 times current Japan's demand. So we would like to engage in the discussion in order to realize this massive potential. So first of all, we will start with the keynote speech. Professor of Public International Law Faculty of Law Sophia University, Professor Kanehara. The floor is yours. Thank you for the kind introduction. I am Kanehara, Sophia University. I would like to express my gratitude to Renewable Energy Institute for the honor of giving me the opportunity for the keynote. I have prepared my slides, and on page 2 and 3, this is my modest background and experience, and based on that, if I may, I offer my presentation with the instruction of the host. In the titles and the subtitles, there are few English translation. Page 4. This is the references including the basic plan on ocean policy as well as other publications for references. Please do go back to this information. Page 5. These are the structure of my presentation. In the introduction, I will talk about the contents of the maritime or marine spatial planning. Under the maritime spatial planning, how it is reflected in the Japanese basic plan on ocean, I will talk about how to establish the MSP in terms of procedures and institutions, and then in order to implement the marine spatial planning, I will present my opinions, and based on that, in terms of offshore wind power generation, I would like to look at the role that marine spatial planning will play. So, marine spatial planning, this is shown on page 6. This is the contents. Please have a look. At the bottom of the slide, I have found this information from this site, which is the Japanese Marine Spatial Plan, which is the meaning is as follows. In the sea, there is navigation, fishing, leisure, or military activities. There are multiple ways of using the ocean, and therefore, for each of the different use, there could be an allocation of the ocean space. So that is what it means about maritime spatial planning. There are 2 points I wish to emphasize. So first of all, marine spatial planning as the policy of the central government, the government and the population must enjoy the maximum benefit, and for that purpose, how to use the sea is determined. In the case of Japan, in terms of sea area that Japan has jurisdiction, you may know Japan's area is the sixth largest in the world. Japan has a right to a massive area of the ocean, and because it is massive, the interest by using the ocean should be optimized and maximized, and planning for that purpose would be crucial. The second point, at the moment, offshore wind is often discussed and attracting attention, but about the exclusive economic zone, EEZ, is under debate. I shall say EEZ. There will be a schematic map later on about this sea. So EEZ, the Japanese population, fishery people, Japanese vessels, not only do they use EEZ, but foreign countries and foreign vessels often pass through or use the space, and therefore under the marine spatial planning, in the allocation of the sea space for different uses, foreign activities and the foreign vessels activities also will have to be given a consideration. Now, in Japan's basic plan, how is the marine spatial planning positioned in Japan's basic plan? Slide page 7, this was the cabinet decision according to the third basic plan on ocean policy. In a nutshell, there are MSPs introduced in various countries, and the Cabinet Office of the Government of Japan will study such overseas cases. Slide 8 and 9. As of 2023, April 28, there was a cabinet decision, and this is the latest basic policy. And the red print, which is the area of focus, I invite you just to check the red characters. So slide 8, I have emphasized the Renewable Marine Utilization Act and the promotion zones designated under the law. Slide 9. To work on specific issues and to advance MSP within EEZ and other zones, to deploy onto other issues and to apply to other complex oceanic situations. A blue language comes also from the third basic policy and is the same in the latest policy. So learning from that, on slide 10, there are more specific aspects. So the procedures to establish a marine spatial plan, how to execute the MSP, how to learn about the experiences of other countries from the third basic plan in 2018 and to the fourth plan as of this year. In the last 5 years, what has been the progress? As for response to specific and concrete issues, or how to apply in the situation of a complex, complicated use of the ocean. What exactly does this mean? And about the promotion zones designated under the Renewable Marine Utilization Act, how this could be recognized as one form within the marine spatial planning. These are some of the issues that come to my mind. Under the fourth basic plan, number 1 and number 3, there is not sufficient description. However, number 1, this is unavoidable, the procedures. Therefore, regarding number 1, I will discuss first, and then I will talk about number 2, number 4, number 5. The procedure to establish marine spatial planning, what institutions are required? So Japan has the 6th largest ocean space, and there are many ways to use the sea, and there are foreign stakeholders, and the sea space should be allocated for diverse use, that is MSP. Depending on the use, it is not only a simple coordination. As a marine policy, how to allocate the sea ocean in order to maximize the interest of the country of Japan and the Japanese population, the plan will decide this dimension. In order to determine that, out of the diverse use, there must be selection and prioritization of the different uses, which is indispensable. And that is the very reason why this is a national policy, a policy by the central government. And therefore, such a judgment by the central government, that is called the integrative judgment by the central government. It must be an integrative decision by all of Japan, and which is the party who makes this decision. Back in 2007, Basic Act on Ocean Policy was established, and under this system, the headquarters for ocean policy was established. Rather than divided between multiple agencies and ministries, the central government needs to establish this policy, and the headquarters for ocean policy was established in order to produce the maritime spatial planning for all Japan policy, and this is in alignment with the basic policy for ocean.
Well then, how could MSB be implemented? Why not think according to the following? Number 1, the maritime space that Japan has can be considered as a closed water tank. So what Japan governs, what Japan controls, it's a water tank that's controlled and governed by Japan. There are seas and oceans that are far beyond. Well, I think this concept of closed water tank is quite opposite to that. But secondly, within the closed water tank, there are a variety of actual uses that are performed. And between and among different uses, there are conflicts. We have to take a careful look at them. And for each specific use, we have to allocate the maritime space based on that. Japan's law and my specialty, international law, in those laws, for each specific use of maritime space, for example, navigation, fishing, leisure, environmental protection, military training or drills, for each specific use, specifically, individually, independently, it's been taken up and dealt with. For example, here in Japan, we have Fishing Act. We have Act to prevent oceanic pollution. So for each area of use, there is a specific independent law, if you could be reminded of that. Well, seas and oceans are very vast. It seems as though they are beyond one's control. And I think that conventional thinking was based on the concept that they're tremendously vast. If seas and oceans are very vast, then coordination of different uses, if there are conflicts, they need to be resolved. And even if that is the case, you don't necessarily have to think about them too seriously if you think that the seas and oceans are too vast. But MSP is based on a totally different concept. It requires a different concept as to how maritime space is to be used. It is to be looked at a closed water tank, and within the tank, we need to view how the oceans and seas are being used, if there are conflicts, if there are harmful effects or damage caused, then we have to take a look and come up with the best optimal way of using maritime space. And that is what MSP is all about. So as such, if we are to look at a closed water tank, well, I think that the concept is not necessarily new. Japan and countries around the world have actually accumulated experience in this regard. And that is in the form of marine protected area. Marine protected area. Japan, for marine protected areas, has already legislated and passed a piece of law, an act for this. So for marine protected areas, look at seas and oceans as a closed water tank to apply regulation. That is the concept. In other words, here again, seas and oceans are viewed as a closed water tank under the concept of marine protected areas. In the interest of time, with respect to marine protected areas, I will not delve into this any further, but let me just emphasize the following. So, MSP, its methodology and implementation, it's not necessarily new, thus it's not necessarily all that difficult. That is the point that I wish to emphasize. So part of marine spatial planning realized in offshore wind power generation. In the fourth basic plan on ocean plan, we will start formulating marine spatial planning based on specific and concrete issues. That was the passage that was included. However, MSP, can it be formulated looking at concrete and individual issues? And is MSP to be implemented independently by the ministries and agencies of authority? And that is because, as I said earlier, we need this all Japan concept if we are to formulate an effective ocean policy. Having said so, these are vast seas. And it's a very large closed water tank. And to come out with an all-encompassing MSP right away is going to be a very difficult task. So, offshore wind power, for such a specific issue, we can come up with an MSP based on that. That could be a very realistic and practical step, actually. So, slide 15, I'm sure you have seen this diagram many times. This must be familiar, a schematic diagram for you. And it comes from the source noted at the very top of the slide. So, offshore wind power generation is to be performed between the coast line to 12 nautical miles. Actually, it's beyond that line, within 200 nautical mile line, or EEZ. We are about to see offshore wind being introduced into the EEZ zone. So, territorial waters versus EEZ. Please look at the diagram and see how the two are different and how the two are delineated. So 12 nautical miles, that's the territorial waters. In 2018, based on the Act on Promoting Utilization of Sea Areas for Renewables Development, there is already a development ongoing under this Act for offshore wind power. Promotion zones are to be selected. There is such a procedure for that. And actually, promotion zones to be selected. In view of other uses of the sea areas, specific to offshore wind power generation, a certain space is going to be allocated as promotion zone, and that exactly is what MSP is about. And therefore, in the fourth basic plan on ocean plan, ocean use, promotion zone determined by the Utilization of Sea Area Act can be defined as one form of MSP. Likewise, EEZ, so that's 200 nautical miles from the coastline. Within the EEZ, to conduct offshore wind power generation, promotion zones must be selected. So MSP, in other words, is going to be essential, indispensable. At this moment, 40 kilometer to 60 kilometer away from the coastline, that's the area assumed for offshore wind. But actually, the scope is much wider than that. As I explained earlier, there could be used by foreign vessels and foreign countries. Inclusive of that, a variety of maritime uses are possible, and in view of that, we have to come up with an MSP. So we have to deal with the relationships we have with foreign countries. The items are shown on slide 17. Well, the state needs to intervene and be involved with all these issues. That also is indispensable. So promotion zone for offshore wind. To swiftly determine the promotion zones is a strong wish from the industry, from what I'm told. Predictability and securing a market size and scale is very necessary, but I must be preaching the choir if I'm to tell this to people in the industry. So MSP, starting from specific issues, it could extend into other uses and other issues. We need to accumulate experience, which is important. So we have the headquarters for ocean policy of Japan. We already have an organization that is fit for leading this effort. So MSP, because it's new, it's an endeavor for the first time. Well, to say that is wrong, because as a methodology, Japan has experienced a similar procedure with respect to a marine protected area. So it is not new. And just because it's time consuming, should we kick the can down the road? Should we delay that? Of course, that is like putting the cart before the horse. So the requests of the industry, the actual use, the experiences of foreign countries, I'm sure they will be shared during this forum. I'm only looking at the framework of MSP. That was the only thing that I conveyed to you. I'm sorry. I could only provide you with the outline. But I do hope that my presentation will be supplemented by the able panelists who will follow me. And with that wish, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Atsuko Kanehara, thank you so much. Excellent, so carefully, clearly, in details at our institute. To talk about the maritime spatial planning at our institute event, it was the first time, but I'm sure it was very compelling and convincing, clear to understand for our audience. Thank you so much. And then going on to theme 1, maritime spatial planning. The moderator is from our institute. Ms. Kudo will moderate this first panel. Thank you for the introduction. I am Kudo, a senior researcher at the Renewable Energy Institute. I will moderate the first panel. So, inviting the panelists. The bio is available from the program at the site, so please forgive me that I will not go into too much details.
Without further ado, let me introduce Professor Yutaka Michida. He's the professor of UT, and he will be participating on UT. He's the professor of Atmospheric Ocean Research Institute. Michida-san, over to you. Yes, I am Professor Michida. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for inviting me as one of the panelists today. As always, Professor Kanehara provided a very succinct, well-organized presentation. And what I wanted to convey, much of it was included, but I would like to provide some additional remarks. So let me share my screen. Can you see the screen? Can you see my slides? Yes, you can. So possibilities and expectations for MSP in Japan. I'm not sure how much I can. So is it moving on? Yes, good. Well, what is MSP? Professor Kanehara gave a very detailed explanation. On the lower right, in 2009, UNESCO came up with this document, a guideline for marine spatial planning. The points are, in order to achieve a number of purposes, to allocate space appropriately, it's a part of public policy. The keywords are stated. The one that I would like to emphasize is at the top, ecosystem-based. What that means is that ecology, economy, and society, we need to strike the balance for these different goals. It's not just about protecting a specific species or to develop specific services only. As was said, marine protected area, offshore wind power generation. Of course, they could be one specific form of use, but the overall goal is to look at this from a complex and comprehensive point of view, and to have optimal use in view of these different purposes. Marine spatial planning. So it's planning. It's not that you come up with a plan and that's it. That's not the end of the exercise. You have to continue planning. So you have to monitor, look at the results, and feed the results back to revise the planning and so forth. Here in Japan, it's not easy, but in overseas countries, so IOC International Conference on MSP, what they've been doing is in this diagram, they started in 2006, they have made steady steps forward. And in 2009, the guideline that I showed you came out. And after that, they've had very large conferences on MSP. So internationally, there's been much progress, which I would like you to understand. as is in top right. Last year in Barcelona, they organized a major conference, which I could not attend. But Professor Wakita Kazumi from Tokai University attended and has brought back a lot of information. So what is the current status internationally? Globally, there has been much progress. This is IOC's statistics. At this moment, those countries who say that they have MSP initiatives, one way or the other, 76. IOC has 150 members, and over half of them, of course, they come in differing levels, but 76 countries already have some kind of MSP initiatives. So 15% of EEZ is covered by MSPs. And by 2030, we want to increase this rate to 30%. That is the international goal. And what Professor Kanehara talked about, how is it viewed in the fourth basic ocean plan? So MSP is a policy, but formulating the policy itself is a large exercise. And it could be specific to some area, but the text here is in the context of DX, digital transformation promotion. And it's still in a draft. It was made public for public commentary. And my comments were also included, which is in red. So it is good to see that offshore wind is a form of MSP. That is fine, but we need to go a step further. We need to pursue initiatives to effectively utilize maritime space overall. And so that is the point. And within the actual policy, highlighted in red, that was added. So we have to study complex or multi-oceanic use. So that is reflected in the text, which is quite new and highly rate. So there has been little progress with respect to MSP. We, the academic scholars at universities, have formed a group. It's an academic group of scholars in this area, and 2017, that's rather old. But we have come up with a guideline for consensus development. It's on the web. Those of you interested, please have a look. So the title, Guideline for Consensus Development in Coastal Zone Utilization. There are several points based on our research results. We have summarized this, and you can see the diagram. So after the preparation period, number 3, so share information amongst stakeholders, and practically, this is what takes most time, but there is some progress made in Japan. As you know, the Cabinet Office, under the direction of the Cabinet Office, MSL, Marine Situational Information Linkage, which is being operated by the Coast Guard of Japan. This is quite innovative. Real-time data can be provided based on a web GIS. You can get comprehensive information about maritime space. It has multiple purposes, but the ultimate purpose is to develop this as a basic tool for MSP. So my point is, number 3, information sharing amongst stakeholders, which is most time consuming, that is already being done. And so internationally, much progress is made, but just to share a sense of a crisis with you, in 2019, 4th MSP Forum in Riga was held. I was the only Japanese attending, and it's in Europe. There are lots of neighboring countries. And so how to coordinate interests with neighboring countries? They are already in that stage. So 300 participants from 44 countries attended, and half of them were younger than 40. Well, I'm not sure what the age groups of the audience today. are, but they were very young, the audience that I took part in. The point is, I think we can see signs of human resources being developed among the younger generation. When we age, Japan will further fall behind if things are as they are right now. Just because it's difficult, are we stalling what we need to address? That's not the case because a lot more progress is made overseas. I think time has matured. We need to work on MSP. That is my message. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Michida. Inviting the next panelist, Mr. Miyahara Masanori. He is the representative at the AFC. The floor is yours. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. I am Miyahara. I would like to introduce my perspective about the challenges. Unlike other speakers so far, I long worked for the Japanese Fisheries Agency, and I was a member of the management at the fisheries organization. So I am a member of the academia. What I am doing is, it sounds like a funny organization, but I provide any conflict solving problems related to fishery. Offshore wind development and the developer is part of my client. So stakeholders, dispute, conflict, relationship management, coordination, that is what I am doing at this moment. And based on what I am doing, I would like to briefly mention my personal position. It seems I've lost my slide pack. This first diagram, this is the current situation of the fishery industry. This is prepared by the Fisheries Agency. A very busy slide, difficult to understand, but one point is US and Japan. On the east and west of the Pacific, there is a surprise, unexpected reduction of fishery resources due to global warming or because of major changes of the current. The Kuroshio is staying in the same place. That kind of marine circumstances are combined, and as a result, there is an unexpected sudden reduction in the resources. On the left-hand side, Japan is so fond of sori, Japanese common squid, and salmon. This appears on a table every day. The upper graph shows the entire catch and its difference. From 2014, it has dropped by 14%. Gradually, you can see the total catch is going down. And we love sori, squid, and salmon. From 2014 as of today, there is a drop of a horrible 80%. So this is the reality. And actually, the fishery people, this was an unexpected crisis, and how the fishery industry can deal with this, they are hugely troubled. Until last month, I was the chair of the advisory of the fisheries agency, and I had to study about what to do with this poor catch. The responses have not been found, no answer found, and therefore, when it comes to offshore wind industry, coordinating in the interest, we have a very bad circumstance, so to say, in order to accommodate offshore wind development. For long, I said, I have been trying to coordinate between stakeholders for conflict and dispute. My feeling is to leave everything to the industry. In terms of stakeholder management, it is all left on the side of the industry. And operators and industry, they only tell the good aspects to the fishery industry. The offshore wind generation and the fishery, that they can coexist, that they can coordinate, that they can live together, that they can prosper together. But the fishery and offshore wind generation, whether the zones can really coexist, let me convince you that is not possible. The wind power, the zone 4 offshore wind development, within that water zones, can you really do fishing together? I do not think so. Large scale fisheries include seine, roundhole net or trawl and dragnet. This is a huge area operation, like covering 500 meters or so. Normally, a fishery covers like 500 meters. So to operate the fishing between wind turbines, no, that is not possible. Of course, from the wind operator side, between the turbine and turbine, the wind operator will not at all accept fishery vessels, and in terms of safety, basically it is not possible to have fishery and the wind power in the same area. As for aquaculture, why don't you cultivate fish in the wind power zone, you say, but this means that there is going to be a huge fish pond, and it's not only one or two, but there will be tens or twenties or so many huge growing ponds or fishing ponds. And to place them between separate wind turbines, again, unrealistic. So in reality, it is just simply impossible. You don't prepare to think about coexistence of wind power and fishery in the same water area. So fundamentally, it must be acknowledged that they cannot exist in the same area. In the world of fishery, there must be a clear delineation of the seasons for fishing and wind power. But the wind development zone, it does not really run counter exactly to fishery. There could be good a combination of Wakayama. There is a zoning of offshore wind development, and the fry of the fish, which is an area where there should not be wind generation, that they can dedicate the area regarding hairtail, as Professor Kanehara mentioned, as a protection zone. If it is designated, then it could be a positive for the wind development, so that a particular area would be dedicated for a particular fish. And if there must be aquaculture at the coastal zone, then rather than having lots and lots of growing ponds, and should be a kind of a raft, like seaweed and shellfish, which does not need daily feeding, or like oyster cultivation piles. So if it is an aquaculture that does not require daily fed culture, that might be possible. So non-fed aquaculture should be given consideration. Also for fishery, blue carbon, I think, is indispensable to be incorporated. And therefore, in this area, for example, for the seagrass bed, to expand seagrass bed, it could be designated as a zone for seagrass, or it could be a zone dedicated for maritime flora. So the maritime spatial planning, this is my position. So 200 nautical miles or within the territorial waters, a fishery do not occupy all that area. Fishery can only be conducted where fish can be caught, and therefore the zone for wind power generation should be clearly separated for the fishing purposes based on scientific data. In the coastal regions, the sandy and shallow sea is a good fishery area. So the fixed bottom, it might be a good location also for wind. So there will be extra coordination required for coastal, but further offshore, that is not the case. There will not be an overlap for good location for fishery and wind. And The large-scale fishery, which requires the Minister of MAF approval, these are wide the waters that go beyond the multiple prefectures of Japan. In this case of cross-prefecture, huge-scale fishery, indeed, this is where central nationwide planning is required. Otherwise, the ocean cannot be developed for multiple uses. So far, to the ocean, to the coastal region, there was a fund for cooperation, but for extensive cross-prefecture uh, uh, activities, how could we apply a kind of a fund to support the relevant regions? That has to be considered. And large scale, whether it be yellowtail or tuna, the large scale fed aquaculture, this could be done in dedicated coastal waters by zoning or allocation. And lastly, the largest challenge, as I showed the first page, the sea is changing, the fishery place is changing year after year. So you cannot fix that this place is for wind or this place is for fishery. It is difficult because the sea itself is changing. As Professor Kanehara mentioned, and also Professor Michida mentioned, real-time data collection has to be strengthened, and on top of that, that has to be shared by all stakeholders based on a third-party objective data to decide is important. Finally, let me repeat. The development zone and the fishery zone and the separation, it cannot be decided by one region, and a fishery industry cannot decide. There must be the leadership of the central government. Yes, indeed, there is the headquarters for ocean policy, but so far there were multiple ministries and agencies, and representatives of multiple ministries got together, and someone tried just to listen to all the opinions of different ministries, but leadership is required for the particular purpose that multiple ministries must cooperate. Without leadership, Japan will not go forward. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. Mihara, thank you. Next, Ms. Isabel Desdobeller, Counselor of Trade Section, Delegation of the European Union to Japan.
The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, and first, thank you for inviting me to join this panel discussion. So, I'm from the delegation of the European Union here in Tokyo, and I am covering, among other issues, the offshore wind power. So, this session is about MSP. So what I intend to do is just to give you a brief overview of the MSP in the EU. And the objective is just to show you that we can compare notes on this, and to see to what extent the EU experience on MSP could be useful to Japan, now that Japan has decided to move forward to the establishment of an MSP. So we have an MSP in place. This started with the introduction of an EU directive in 2014, and what is interesting regarding this directive is that basically we provide for a legal framework for national MSPs. So we have set a list of requirements and obligations, and these are the requirements and obligations that the 22 coastal member states in the EU have to follow when they design their own national maritime spatial planning. So it is quite interesting because we have this framework with all those requirements, but then it's in the hands of the member states to decide on the format, on the content of the MSP, and also on the institutional setup, for instance, or all the different activities will be allocated in the maritime space. So why I'm insisting on this is because we tend to believe that this could be, the architecture of the directive could be something that would nicely fit, we believe, the setup for Japan when they established the MSP, meaning that you would have a legal framework, but also something that is established at a horizontal level. So it would steer the process at central and horizontal level, but it will give flexibilities at the local level to also take into account the specificities for the design of your MSP. So these are the requirements. The ecosystem-based approach was already referred to, and I don't have time now, but we can expand later on when we meet for the reception or whatever to discuss on those specific requirements. But these are obligations for all member states. So the idea was that the member states, they were invited, or not invited, they were obliged to adopt their national MSP by the 31st of March 2021. So this is the state of play. The majority of them have indeed now an MSP in place. We still have a few member states with no MSP or not a completed process yet, but we are, of course, working with those member states to get them there. I'm also showing you a map, an example of a national MSP. This is the one that Belgium has established. And what is interesting here is that, you know, Belgium is a small country. The shoreline, the coastline is also quite short. So it means that it's a limited maritime area in which they had to allocate the space to a lot of activities. But they managed to do that. And what is interesting also is that they have done that in full cooperation, of course, with their neighbors. So in the bordering area, there is what we call the sea basin approach, so that with the Netherlands, they consulted each other to see what would be the impact, of course, of the allocation of that space for that specific activity. And the cross-border cooperation with the other member states, but also with the non-EU countries, this is one of the obligations we have to follow for the establishment of our national MSPs. Of course, there were many challenges. The first is that for most member states, this was a first-time exercise. And it was a lot of activities, a lot of objectives that they had to take into consideration. So it has been challenging, of course. The second is, because this is quite a far-reaching exercise, it entailed a lot of cooperation and coordination with the national agencies and ministries, with the coastal regions, with the neighbors, but also, of course, with the stakeholders, the non-governmental stakeholders. Another challenge has been in terms of collecting and compiling data. Some data were not comprehensive enough, or they were difficult to get from certain ministries, for instance. The coherence of plans across neighboring countries. So I explained already that this required, of course, the cooperation with all the different neighboring countries. And this happened, but of course, it requires extra effort to put in place cooperation. It could be at bilateral level, it could be at regional level. So there are multiple of possibilities there. And yes, we just heard about the views of the fishing industry. It's always difficult to prioritize measures or sectors over one over each other. But this is something that you have to do with in mind what is the final or the ultimate policy objectives. And at some point, a decision has to be made. And again, this is the transboundary challenges, but this links to the cooperation across the borders. applying a sea basin approach. We believe that all those challenges are worth working on because the benefits coming from MSP are numerous. And the first of it is that it reduces conflict between what we might call the competing sectors, but sometimes the sectors are not that competing. There could be synergies between sectors. It reduces conflict because also in the process of MSP, you are consulting the stakeholders, you are really involving all the different parties, and then at a very early stage, then you identify the issues and you manage to integrate the views of all the relevant parties. It encourages investment. This is, of course, key to unleash offshore wind power. Because there is more predictability, you have clear rules, etc., etc. It increases cross-border cooperation, and then neighbors cooperate on developing energy grids. They cooperate on submarine cables, and so on and so forth. Of course, very good for the environment, because there is also this coordination and clear rules and objectives to protect and preserve the environment. And then finally, it's always very good because it puts on the political agenda the importance of the seas and the oceans, and this raises also awareness of a broader audience. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to take your question later on. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Next up is the last panelist for this session, Mr. Pelayo Rodriguez Alonso. He's the Japan representative and Senior Business Initiatives Manager for Ocean Winds.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Please start.
Thank you. I hope the battery still keeps running for the rest of the session. I'm going to keep it quite brief, so I hope it's fine. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be with such a distinguished and knowledgeable panelists together. And because I don't know how much time we'll have for the panel, I will be brief, and I would also like to start from the conclusion. And it's interesting because we have here from academia, we have here from the government, but we have also two stakeholders, let's say, the fisheries, and I will try to represent the developers, not only Ocean Winds, but the developers in general. And I cannot agree more with the last point made by Miyahara-san, which is we need some leadership. And I think he was referring to the government. I think he was referring to the nation, to Japan. Leadership is needed to create the maritime spatial planning. It's a very difficult task, but it has to be done. So jumping into what we do and to Ocean Winds and how we have been affected, because in every country where we operate, we encounter rights over the sea and maritime spatial planning. I will start briefly explaining for those of you who don't know us, who we are. We are a European company, a joint venture between two major companies in the renewable industry. And we have one peculiarity, something special about us, which is that we only focus on offshore wind. So we are kind of experts only in that area, not all renewables, but only offshore wind. And you can see the numbers there. This is a commercial presentation, but I think we can also get some conclusions. Of the 16 gigawatts that we have right now in development, all of them are thanks to zoning. So basically, the areas, or most of them, have been selected by the government, or there is some involvement of the government. Japan is a special case in which absolutely everything, or we say mostly, is led by developers, which creates, as was mentioned before, Miyahara-san, some difficult conversations on difficult understanding between the two parties. And I think we need a neutral part in the middle, just to be in the middle and explain to each other what are the needs for both activities. This is us. We are involved from the very beginning. You can see a picture there of what we're trying to do also, which is on the development stage, and now that we're building, of course, offshore is still a young industry, so we need still more studies, but we understand the aquaculture and also studies on how the wind farms can affect on creating places where the fish can thrive. It's not necessary that having wind farms is detrimental to the fishing or the mollusk or the different animals in the area. We are seeing, for example, there's study in Europe for lobsters, where we see the lobsters have increased even, or mollusks that have increased in the areas where the wind farms are located. And we are involved, at least Ocean Winds is involved in all the parts of the development and build, operation, and finance. So we are involved from the very beginning to the end, and also I think it's an important part of the maritime space planning, which is also temporal. It's not something that is forever, has to change. And usually, for example, in terms of offshore wind, we're seeing like 25, 30 years, and they can be like a temporal mandate for the maritime spatial planning. And finally, this is my last slide. So as I mentioned, I promised to be short. And this shows where our projects are. And I would like to explain briefly, not on our expertise or what we have achieved, but more on the topic that we are discussing today, that most of those projects are both in the EEZ and the territorial waters. So both areas are being used. And when I talk to my colleagues, of course, if they have expertise in law, they will know what the EEZ is, but none of my colleagues knows in Europe or the US what the EEZ is, because there is no differentiation in terms of the development, at least for the developer side. The government leads on that regard, selects the areas, and there is no big differentiation. This is important because we're seeing a debate now in Japan about the two areas, and maritime spatial planning, of course, can be done only in the EEZ, but can also be done on the territorial waters. This is something that can be done. Germany does it in all the states. It started with the states that are close to Denmark. And they allow the states to lead on that part, but it's also maritime spatial planning. And I think, although we are discussing a lot of floating and EEZ, maritime spatial planning could be also useful for the rounds that we're seeing now, round 2, round 3, in Japan, round 4, that are territorial waters. So it's not something, I would like to clarify this, exclusive of the EEZ. It's something that can be in general. And another point I want to make, and maybe we can discuss also later on, but this is the last one, is I would like all of you, most of you I think are Japanese or have a long experience in Japan, to look, and this is part of the reason I'm speaking today here, is to have a vision of, international vision of what's going on with the maritime spatial planning. Basically, Japan is lagging behind in terms of the implementation. As mentioned before, I think it was 100 countries already have some discussion, and 76, I think it was written down in the previous presentation, have some implementation. The biggest neighbor in Asia, China, from 2002 has a maritime spatial planning, 2002, which is, 20 years ago. And another thing I want to mention is that the maritime spatial planning is not created only for offshore wind. Of course, offshore wind is an important reason why maritime spatial planning is established, but the reason, and I think the Professor Mihasan will explain and know more about this, is for protecting special areas. In fact, the main or the first time that a maritime spatial planning or zoning was created was in Australia for the reef there, and it was established in 1987. And since the start, UNESCO too has been creating maritime spatial planning for protecting areas. So it's not only focused on offshore wind, it's a way to have absolutely everyone coexisting in a very huge, I mean, in terms of Japan, enormous area, which is the sea. And I hope this discussion today, if we have enough time still, will be useful for you and help you learn a little bit more about what we do in other countries and how we can implement this in Japan. Thank you so much.
ありがとうございました。それでは少しの
Thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time left, but we would like to move on to the panel discussion. We would like to rearrange the settings, so if you could bear with us for a moment, we're going to rearrange for the panel discussion. Thank you. Panelists, Professor Kanehara, Mr. Amihara, Mr. Pelayo Rodriguez Alonso, Ms. Isabella do Spilreiter, Professor Michida is participating via online. So all the panelists, if you could please come on stage. Thank you. We only have 15 minutes according to the time schedule. Time is limited, but we would like to hear lots of different comments, views, and have discussions. So first of all, I have prepared 3 topics for the panel. Number one, MSP and a Renewable Energy Marine Area Utilization Act. Look at MSP from the Act's perspective. So the fourth basic plan for ocean policy states that the Japanese government is to establish Japan's own maritime spatial planning methodology and also use Act as part of marine spatial planning. And we have to coordinate the interests of stakeholders, which is an important aspect. But when it comes to Renewable Marine Area Utilization Act, it does have a problem because it's taking too much time to coordinate the interests of the stakeholders as of today. So what are the challenges today and how can we address them so that we can overcome them? So let's quickly look at this issue. So those of you in the field, Miyahara-san, Mr. Miyahara-san, and Mr. Alonso, if you could comment. What is the problem? Data sharing? Is that the problem? Or who's doing the coordination amongst stakeholders? Who's leading the effort to coordinate the interests of stakeholders? Some of you mentioned in your presentations, but 1 minute each, please. So may I? Well, I've already said this.
The stakeholder management, including the fishery industry, at least it must be a public party. But if you leave it to the industry and you ask for the candidate sites, and if you go through auction and bidding to get the industry start first, that would be even more confusing. From the very beginning, there must be a public sector organization, a government-related party, not the local government authority. It must be at least prefecture government, and if it is cross-prefecture, it must be the central government of Japan.
Mr. Pelayo, Alonso.
I will keep it short again, and I can say that I cannot agree more what have been said. And I think Michida-san knows this by her probably, but I will go to the definition of what's maritime spatial planning, and I think that's the reason why it will be helpful. Instead of having developers and fisheries talking, I think we have the government, and the definition is the MSP, so the maritime spatial planning, is a public process. So we all are invited to discuss, all the stakeholders, of analyzing, allocating spatial and temporal distribution of human activities in the marine area, so it's the sea basically, to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives that are usually, and the most important thing is the end, that usually is through a political process. So you need a political will. And as of today, I think political will has been shown in many ways from the government, but what we need now is more concrete action and some steps on how will be organized this maritime spatial planning. And I think will be very, very useful both for fisheries and for companies like us. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。それでは少し駆け足ではござい
Well,
ます。
then we have to rush through, but let me move on to the next topic. MSP and EEZ, or international relations. So here in this topic, not necessarily just offshore wind, but a broader use of seas and oceans. From that perspective, what can we say about MSP and EEZ? As has been said, with respect to offshore wind, it will be extended into EEZs, and then the way in which it's regulated will change, and we need to also be mindful of international relations. So from that perspective, let me say the following, and this is a new issue I did not include first. So Kanehara-san and Michida-san, I would like to ask this to you. Japan is surrounded by the seas. Here in Japan so far, we have not had an MSP. Why? And in order to overcome that, what can we do? So if you could please comment, Professor Kanehara.
Thank you. In Japan, maritime spatial planning, and this is my area of expertise, but in view of establishing an MSP in light of the Ocean Basic Law, how to establish? Please respond to that question by explaining what I have been thinking for a long time. Offshore wind project is under consideration in many EEZ sites, but EEZ is a low profile, not that well known a system under the legislation, not that widely known, and therefore, first of all, in terms of legislation, the international law on the sea, there must be, first of all, correct, accurate knowledge. So first of all, to communicate clearly about existing legislation, and all the stakeholders would have to make the effort to have a correct understanding about the existing legislation. Otherwise, as I mentioned, the interest for the country of Japan and the populace of Japan has to be maximized, and without accurate understanding of the legislation, first of all, regarding the low-profile EEZ, the start point is that the stakeholders must share correct understanding, and the MSP must be established in a way to maximize national interest, which means to enable offshore wind generation. That is impossible to maximize the interest for the country and the population. And already in the territorial waters until 12 nautical miles, wind projects are already under execution, but which does not attract much attention. But even within territorial waters, foreign vessels do navigate. Even within the territorial waters, there is the navigation of foreign vessels and coordination between the wind project that is necessary. It's a funny name, but there is the innocent passage under UNCLOS. However, this innocent passage of the foreign vessels, under the Japanese legislation, it is strictly regulated, and therefore in that regard, the coordination between offshore wind, it is easy and advantageous for Japan because of the strict law. But when it comes to the exclusive economic zone, as I mentioned in my presentation, the foreign vessels, they have the freedom of navigation. They have complete freedom. They have right to freedom navigation. To put it simply, within EEZ, for Japan to develop offshore wind and foreign vessels' right of freedom of navigation, it is totally equal, even, and 50-50. And therefore, coordination is entirely different between EEZ and territorial waters, very difficult in EEZ. And the right of the other party must not be undermined. A coordination with your counterparty must be successful in order to enable Japan's offshore wind to realize the potential in the EEZ. So already there is wind project in the territorial waters, and what we're trying to do in EEZ, the application of UNCLOS will be very different, and therefore correct, accurate understanding under the law is required, and partly my responsibility I would like to advocate, and I ask for the correct understanding by all stakeholders in the longer term. Maximum national interest can be derived by MSP. Thank you.
Thank you. May I turn to Michida-san, please? Thank you. So Professor Kanahara provided the legal framework. So I would like to say a word or two from the international relations perspective. As I said in my presentation, already in many countries, MSP exists. And Japan was thinking about this, we are falling behind. It's a fact that lots of other countries already have an MSP, and maybe neighboring countries as well. Korea, China, of course, their MSPs differ in terms of quality and the content. The social fabric, of course, of each country is different, but they do have MSP of some sort. And so MSP that exists in neighboring countries, which Japan lacks. And we won't be able to have discussions, effective discussions with neighboring countries when we have some sort of conflicts or disputes in contiguous waters. And so I hope this is understood by the government, the fact that we lack MSP, we need an MSP. The government needs to understand that. And in relation to an earlier question, I agree with what Mihara-san said. Starting with a developer taking the initiative, that could be difficult. The developer and the existing stakeholders, including the fisheries industry, they are on equal footing. And who should be coordinating? It's the public sector, either the local government or the national government. We need to come up with a framework involving all of that. So we have to be resolved. We have to have the determination to create that framework. An example in the US is that the starting line developer was taking the lead at the start, but it did not work out. So the state government had to be involved. And with the lead of the state government, the process was expedited in coming up with an offshore wind project. The same could apply to Japan. So in specific sea area, much is placed on the shoulders of the developer, but given the amount of work that's necessary, the workload could be very large. It could be greater. And so we need to understand that the government needs to be involved. Thank you, Michida-san. And so let me ask about EU's experience to Isabella-san. Well, in the EU, in order to coordinate international relations and conflicts, you use MSP, but there are some countries who have yet to formulate an MSP. So for those countries, what are the impediments? What are the reasons as to why some of the countries have yet to come up with an MSP? In order to overcome such impediments, if there are any, what needs to be done by that particular country? Or what could EU be doing to assist those countries so that they can come up with an MSP? If you could share EU's experience, please.
Yeah, sorry. What can be done and how can we support, right? So that is your question. Well, first, of course, just to come back briefly on this question, in Europe, MSP, they cover coastal, territorial, and EEZ. And this is extremely important because doing so, it helps to clarify what are the different rules and obligations applicable, because different rules apply in all these different areas. So this is absolutely essential so that we have a better idea of what could be the uses, who could be the users, and the key conditions, who should we consult with? I heard a lot already about that. So this is absolutely fundamental. About having this in place, I understand that MSP establishment takes time. right? But first, I want to say it's perfectly normal because that's a complex process. And as we heard many times already, we need to consult many, many different stakeholders and parties. So this is perfectly normal. For us, it took 7 years. I understand in Korea it took 10 years, so all fine with that. But it has to take reasonable time. And for in order to move forward, you have again to rely on a strong political leadership, a government that is ready to steer this political process, that has set clear and ambitious policy objectives. It also needs to provide support to the authorities or those stakeholders working together towards an MSP. Without support from the central government, this cannot happen. And so it includes the fact that we need a neutral party to have those consultations being done. And finally, of course, the EU is most ready to support. And I heard many challenges here or issues that you raised that somehow we addressed as well. So I would be very pleased to have further discussion with whoever here would be interested in that, and to share with you how we managed to address those conflicts and to move forward.
はい、ありがとうございました
Yes, thank you very much for that. Lastly, I would like each panelist to say a few words on the following. Well, the point here is that it takes time. So what to think about that? Because it's time consuming. Because it's time consuming, we should start early. Some have mentioned. So in order to accelerate offshore wind power generation, and if it's going to take 10 years, it will be very difficult to accelerate power generation through offshore wind. So how should we think about MSP and the need for accelerating offshore wind? So may I invite just a word from each panelist? Do we need to provide more data? Is that what's necessary? Or understanding the actual usage, actual situation, that's also necessary. We need to have accurate information and data to understand the situation correctly. There must be various points or various perspectives. So what are the specific actions, and how can we go about overcoming the fact that it takes time? So first of all, Miyahara-san, may I turn to you? I'm sorry. Yes, Miyahara-san first, and then Pelayo-san. Pelayo-san, Mr. Alonso. And there could be some overlap, but from earlier comments, but Isabella-san, and then Kanehara-san, Professor Kanehara, and then Professor Michida. So Miyahara-san first, please.
この海洋空間計画に時間がかかるというのは確かにそうなのかもしれない。
About taking time for MSP to establish the MSP, but at the beginning, as Professor Kanehara mentioned, prioritization is critical. Therefore, in order to transition to renewables, if we have to go for green transition, that must be the top priority and start with the relevant season. I think we can go ahead with relevant seasons for expanding renewable. If you start by looking at the entire sea area that you have to work on, you can't start. So start with priority areas and start with which area. There must be a serious discussion about prioritization. And then at least if the priority is the relationship between fishery and offshore wind, that can go ahead. And the most important part, if that can be completed, maybe the other areas can go smoothly. We should not shy away. Rather than starting with the entire ocean area, we must start with the priority area and just start making the plan. Thank you.
ありがとうございます
Thank you very much.
I'd like to mention 4 points. The first one is provide some understanding of how important is this, because in Japan, I think even 3 years, 4 years ago, we were talking about reducing the cost of electricity, LCOE, and building the proper supply chain, many topics that are very important, but this is the basis. I mean, if we don't have these, those other things will not happen. This is the first step in order to have visibility for developers and for everyone in the industry, renewable industry in the sea. So this is very important. We have to give it the importance that it merits. Completely unrelated to what mentioning what Isabel was saying before, I think if you have time and some understanding of English, there's a website, a wonderful website by the European Union about the MSP. If you put MSP European Union, something like that on your search engine, MSP platform, she's telling me. It's wonderful because it explains you absolutely how it's done, not only the legislation, which can be boring to read, but also a lot of charts, explanations, and it's very, very clear. And I think when starting from zero is very difficult. So I think Japan, as of today, can copy many of the ways in which the US, as was mentioned before, or the European Union is proceeding. And finally, talking about targets, about ideas, about meetings, it's very good. In fact, it's encouraging. We love to put targets for 2050 or even farther away, but I think we have to start from concrete steps. And I will suggest, because everyone's asking how we can do it. So I will give 3 or 4 ways, let's say. The first step is organizing a process. And how we organize a process for the maritime spatial planning. The 4 steps that I summarize here, after reading a lot of papers, is planning a mandate and a team. A team means a governmental team. That can be interministerial or can be the cabinet office of any governmental team that is able to have a mandate and coordinates, because this implies not only stakeholders, you have to also think about the Navy, you have to think about the environmental ministry, then create the principal goals and objectives that we want to achieve with this maritime resource planning, the boundaries and the time frame. So we have to put a time frame in which we want to accomplish that, because we don't have it right now, and the boundaries. Belgium is an amazing example, but it's very small. Japan is very big. So maybe we can do it in steps. Maybe one zone can start before than other zones, because it's very, very big to cover all in one maritime spatial planning. And finally, not to forget, that has been mentioned today many times, stakeholder participation. We need to invite everyone to the table to discuss and finally try to build consensus as much as possible. It will be difficult to have 100% everyone agreeing, but at least try to do that. And that's everything from my side.
では、はい、イザベラさん。
Isabella-san, please.
Yes, I already covered more or less before your question. But again, I agree. We need to set policy and priorities. That's the starting point. But I understand that the objective is to unleash the potential of the blue economy in general. So that is why we need to. We can no longer use the oceans on a first-come, first-served basis. This is no longer possible. So that is why having an MSP is absolutely critical. And again, we need this to be steered at a central level, at political level, and also to look at the experience acquired overseas. But just a small point, at the same time, not in the meantime, there is more that can be done also to accelerate the development of offshore wind. While the MSP is in the making. So there are many strings that could be pulled already in Japan. We heard now this development of floating offshore wind in the EEZ. I think there is a potential to move a bit faster on that one, while the MSP is in the making, but also all this tendering process that we have, round 1, round 2, next year, round 3. I mean, also there's a lot of, I mean, there is room for improvement as well in terms of transparency, simplifying the procedures, central impact assessment. So these are already, these are all also elements that you should look at in the meantime if you want to see the development of offshore wind energy moving a bit faster in Japan.
ありがとうございます。それでは
Thank you. Professor Kanehara.
In my presentation, I said it is not entirely difficult, that there are experiences, and there is the headquarters for ocean policy. I mentioned that we do have existing experiences or frameworks or organizations. So let me try to avoid repetition. But this is a very important symposium, workshop, conference, and there are many significant events taking place. However, based on the recognition that I will mention now, there must be a discussion at multiple levels, and then there must be integrated, comprehensive discussion. First of all, for the specific sea zone, like fishery and the offshore wind, how exactly to coordinate in a particular sea area. There is a specific sea area that has to be dealt with in a particular sea area. And then as a specific issue, for example, the technology of the offshore wind, which technology is safe, which technology is profitable. Selection of the technology is another dimension, and my area of expertise is legislation. And then another dimension at a different level, which is the marine policy. In terms of marine policy, how can the sea be used? How should we use the sea? That is another level. And the final level, I think, is for the country of Japan, not only marine policy, but for decarbonization for Japan and for energy security for Japan. These are the nationwide policies, and within that, how to position marine policy and how to position maritime spatial policy. Those discussions are required. So discussions at multiple discussions are required. There must be in-depth discussion, accumulation of discussions, and then the overall discussion has to take place in a fora or a forum. Yes, it is necessary, even if it might be time-consuming. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Lastly, Professor Michida, please. Yes, thank you. Just briefly, 3 points. I agree with everyone else. So 3 points from my perspective. Number 1, the fourth basic plan and ocean policy. The initiatives under RE Utilization Promotion Act, they should be positioned within the basic plan. That's very fine. So we have the right positioning, and that's not the end of the exercise. If we end there, we will not be achieving the primary objective. So positioning is done. What happens then, and what can be done? So we need to look at the text of the basic plan, and the government needs to address this very seriously. So that's point number 1. And as everyone else said, it's clear that it's going to be difficult to come up with MSP. So allocation of maritime space in an optimal manner, considering complex use, it's not going to be easy. Just because it's difficult, can we afford not to start, not to draw up a plan? Well, it's the same with any exam. Because it's difficult, don't we have to do it? Of course we have to do it. So for the world, for Japan, if it's necessary, even if it's difficult, we have to tackle it. We have to achieve it. So that's something that we need to remind ourselves of. Number 2. And number 3, step by step, we can go through as a. So IOC guideline says that we can go step by step because everyone knows it's difficult. And those countries who have MSPs from the beginning, they have gone through such steps, and they're aware that it's difficult. And at the time of actually putting this into work, data sharing, it takes a lot of time, a lot of money. We have MSIL, so that can be utilized. Well, in view of MSP, we need to come up with MSIL, but MSIL came first. We have the data platform. So whatever is lacking, we can make additions, and we can utilize MSIL. And I think there's enough social demand. And in terms of technology, not everything, but technology-wise, we have to some extent. So we have come to a point where we need to do this. Time is ripe. Time is mature. So I just recited a Japanese poem, but time has come. So that should be the spirit with which we need to formulate MSP. That would be all. Thank you.
田様ありがとうございました。
So Professor Michida, thank you.
手際で
Because of the poor moderatorship, we
会話
have taken longer, but
終了とさせていただきます。
we would like to conclude this session regarding MSP. I would like to thank the panelists once again. So members of the audience, please give them another big round of applause. So Kudo-san, thank you. And the speakers, thank you very much. We're behind schedule. We were supposed to have a 30-minute break, but we would like to shorten that to 15 minutes, and we're going to reconvene at 25 minutes past the hour. During the break, please take this opportunity to exchange your business cards. There are more than 300 participants online. Those of you online, you will enjoy your break for the next 15 minutes. And next session, we're going to have another big theme about training and skills, and lots of distinguished panelists. Please look forward to that. So please utilize the break from now for exchanging business cards and getting to know each other. Thank you. We're going to reconvene at 25 minutes past the hour. Thank you.
はい、それではパート
Thank you. We will start part 2.
は先ほど冒頭申し
As was mentioned at the outset, we will talk about human resources development, the current situation, the challenges and the barriers. There will be 2 keynote speakers at the beginning.
まずは基調報告
First of all, the first keynote speaker from Japan Wind Power Association, General Manager of Engineering Department Number 2, Mr. Yoshimura, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. As has been introduced, my name is Yoshimura from JWPA. Thank you for the opportunity today. So from my side, Japan Wind Power Association, JWPA's initiative to train human resources talent training. So in my presentation, I would like to raise a few issues for the panel to address later. Now, there are 3 points. So offshore wind skills guide and the estimated number of people necessary for offshore power and the roadmap and necessary measures for human resources development. It's rich in content, so I may have to skip a few slides along the way. I hope that is all right. So first, as you know, the goal is to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050, and offshore wind power is to be adopted increasingly. But for manufacturing and maintenance of offshore wind, many human resources are required, and therefore manpower shortage is a concern. However, this is not a new concern. For maintenance of onshore wind, it's been pointed out for some time that there's a shortage of labor. So that risk, those who have noticed the risk have been taking individual initiatives, but we have not been able to resolve a labor shortage. So human resource shortage. Well, overall, there's a labor shortage. Decline in workforce here in Japan is not restricted to offshore wind industry. That is happening throughout the nation. And as the needs are diversifying, services are diversifying. And so many sectors or industries are having shortage of people to run their operations. And offshore wind is a new industry, at least that's how it's defined. But like Europe's oil development, subsea oil development, there's not a lot of people that we can repurpose. That is another factor in labor shortage. So as we look to secure labor, Well, the main source of employment in this country is to hire new graduates, but that's not enough. So we need to transfer labor from other sectors and industries to offshore wind. Now, the fact that there are jobs available in offshore wind, job descriptions and the significance of jobs, they need to be broadly understood and people's awareness raised. So that is something that we need to tackle as well, raising awareness. So from such a perspective, I would like to share with you what our initiative is. So first, Offshore Wind Skills Guide. In June last year, we published this on our website, JWPA's website. I may be repeating, but industrial transition, immaturity of industry, green growth that's needed, a labor shortage throughout the nation. We need to overcome these challenges as a nation. And each area of work for offshore wind, so survey, design, manufacturing, assembly, installation, operation, maintenance, and removal. In each area, what are the job descriptions? What are the kind of people that we need? What are the necessary skills and qualifications? What are the industries and jobs that are related to this? We have summarized that so that we will know what kind of skills and people we need for offshore wind. And we would like the workers who already work in society, local governments, educational institutions, high school students, and college students to look at this, utilize this. For those who are considering a job in offshore wind industry, or those who are considering developing human resources. And here are the details. I will not delve into all the details because it's going to take a lot of time if you could look at them later. So this is the estimated number of people required for offshore wind in order to achieve carbon neutrality. In order to pursue offshore wind, how many people do we need? What's the manpower necessary? We have done a questionnaire survey among the member companies of our association. Based on that, we came up with estimates. Now, as to the procedure, we have set assumed adoption. So 8 gigawatt in 2030, 45 gigawatt in 2040, 100 gigawatt in 2050. So this is the capacity adopted. This is not based on the projects. This is actual adoption. So industrial vision and basic plan on energy. Well, these are numbers higher than those numbers. So in order to achieve carbon neutrality, these are the capacities of installation that we think we need. And so based on this, we have assumed how many people we would need to run a model farm. And based on the questionnaire survey, we have come up with the estimated number of people necessary with model farms A and B. Well, there are a variety of people necessary, and there could be duplications or overlaps, and so we made an effort to eliminate overlaps to the extent possible. And for information that was not available through surveys, we tried to supplement them from sourcing information from overseas. It takes about 10 years for an offshore wind to be developed. So in one particular year, the number of estimated manpower necessary, well, it depends on the stage of the project. And so different stages of projects are considered 2030, 2040, 2050. For each year, how many are necessary, we have estimated. I'm sorry for the text, the heavy text, but these are points to consider or points to be careful about. If you could read them through later, it would be appreciated. We may not been able to cover all the types of jobs or roles that are required. Well, we're based on the assumption that model farms are to be operated, and then how many people are necessary. If there are people necessary who are not directly involved with the operation of farms, then they are not necessarily counted. And so I'm talking about personnel that would be directly necessary for the farm's operations. And there are, of course, those who will be indirectly involved, which is outside of the scope of this exercise. And the results of the estimation are as follows. Lower right, in 2030, 15,700 people, 2040, 38,200 people, 250, 48,500 people. So these are the numbers estimated to be required for offshore wind. And the breakdown for each area of work is given in the same table. In 2030, the amount installed is limited, but after another a decade or two, 2040, 2050, especially around maintenance work, more people will be required. So the number of people or laborers, well, it's the same graph. It's color-coded in a different manner. Based on the UK literature, this is a breakdown by the role or the job. So people working at desk and technicians who work in the field, that's the breakdown. So field engineers, field technicians, you can see that the proportion of field engineers and technicians will be rising as a proportion. Conversely put, we need to develop such people and we need to send them to the field increasingly. Next. So this is a finer categorization of the jobs or roles. So within offshore wind skills guide, these categories are used. I'm sorry for the small print, but 30 to 40 different roles or job types are listed. And what can we say out of this? So what's highlighted in red? So offshore safety training and maintenance training. How many people need to go through such training programs? As of 2050, for maintenance training, 7,800 people. For offshore safety training, which involves, of course, construction and maintenance and whatnot, 17,000 people need to go through such training for safety offshore, that is. So I said that we need training, and obviously we need training facilities for that. In various parts of Japan, there are training facilities in various places around the world that are already up and running, and there's a plan. And we have done some interviews and surveys to put together this map. The locations are not well dispersed. Of course, sites planned for offshore wind. Close to such sites, we see more training facilities. And of course, that's only reasonable. But in the future, in areas where there are no training facilities, we might want to have one or at least two or so such facilities. And in population centers, megalopolis, where it's convenient to come to, we should have some more training facilities. So we want people to think that there's a training facility nearby that they can go to undergo training. That would be convenient for the trainees. We would be able to create an enabling environment for training. Well, then, how many training facilities do we need? As of 2050, we need 17,000 people to go through safety training, 7,800 people to go through maintenance training, and you can see the number of facilities necessary here. So what is the demand for training? That's the second table from the top. So training, well, not the same group of people will go through training every year. Different people will be taking GWO once every 2 years, so you have to go through the training. And maintenance, it's not a one-off training. After several years, you have to undergo retraining. Well, you may have undergone initial training, but if you lack practical experience, you need to have a refresher's course to refresh your knowledge. And so based on that, what will be the demand for training? That's estimated in the second table. So as of 2050, on an annual basis for safety, 11,400 people; for maintenance training, 2,400. That's our estimate. And what is the capacity of the training facility? That's to the right. And if you divide that, well, then we will know how many training facilities and vacancy slots per annum. So in 2030, 8 facilities; 2040, 10 to 20; 2050, 15 to 30 facilities. Well, this is based on a number of assumptions. So there may be different numbers, but at this moment, I understand that 8 facilities are either being planned or considered. At one point in the future, there could be excess of facilities. That was a slight concern that we had. But anyway, these are the numbers necessary. And the measures and roadmap for human resources development. So we need to have comprehensive vision. We need to develop ready-to-work people. We need to educate for the future generation. Right now, we may be all right, but after 40 years, 50 years, those in the elementary school will be working. So for those people, we want them to be engaged in offshore wind. It doesn't have to be offshore wind. They could be in renewables. And we want to provide increased exposure to what renewables are to these children. And as to the measures that I talked about, so when is this going to happen, by who? And that is put together in the form of a roadmap like this. Who needs to do what by when? And some is already initiated. There are others that need to start soon. So with the tripartite collaboration, academia, government, and industry, and development of human resources, of course, it's not a one-off exercise. As long as the offshore wind industry continues, we have to continue training talents. And together with you, that is what we would like to promote and pursue. Time is up, right? If you could please have a look at this summary later. Thank you. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The presentation material will be uploaded later on our site. Thank you very much. And then we would like to invite the next keynote speaker from the UK, Associate of Carbon Trust, Ms. Rosanna Jackson. Rosanna, thank you for joining us from London. The screen is yours.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I'm hoping that. Perfect. Thank you. So I will dive into the presentation. Thank you so much, Yoshimura-san, for the wonderful overview. It's a fantastic complement to what I'm going to be talking about today. So just to begin, my name is Rosanna Jackson. I work for the Carbon Trust, and today I'm going to be talking more about the recommendations to support skills development for offshore wind in Japan. And hopefully this complements what Yoshimura-san has been talking about, because the question is, how can we get the people into the industry? What sort of options do we have? And I'll be talking a little bit more about tangibly the type of thinking and the changes and approaches we need to tackle the skills problem. So just as a very quick introduction, the Carbon Trust's mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. We have offices across 5 continents. In Asia, they're in Beijing, China, Singapore, and we're over 400 experts and consultants. And you're welcome to reach out to us to talk more about this topic. We had the honor of collaborating with the Renewable Energy Institute to understand and and consider what more can be done to facilitate offshore wind deployment in Japan. And this was in 2020 when we realized there was a lot of focus on cost reduction, a lot of focus around R&D innovation, but we need to also consider the issue around people fulfilling that R&D and people fulfilling those offshore wind projects. So very soon our attention turned to, we can see this great pipeline, but how can we get skills systems in place? So we've published this report in March this year. It's available in English and Japanese, and I'd be very grateful if you could have a look at the details. In this report, we cover the context of offshore wind in Japan, the policies, the regulatory landscape, the market. We also introduce the scope of skills, and we aimed to be consistent with the JWPA skills guide report. So that is the scope of skills that we're talking about in Japan. And what we hoped to contribute was to look at Japan in relation to some other international offshore wind markets, both developed, such as the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, and newer offshore wind markets like the USA and Taiwan. And then we considered what are the Japan-specific challenges with skills, because skills is a global issue and it is a bottleneck for all countries. So you're not alone in this challenge. And we put all of this thinking together into the 5 recommendations, which I will go into briefly in this discussion and in the panel. So our question was to ask, to what extent is there a need for action on skills development for Japan to meet its large-scale offshore wind deployment ambitions? So you can see on the right-hand side of the ambition of 10 gigawatt by 2030 or 30 to 45 gigawatt by 2040. And clearly this encompasses a whole range of skills, which the JWPA skills guide goes into in a lot of detail. But just to emphasize some of the questions, that it is a very complex landscape of skills across the whole life cycle of the offshore wind farm development, from early stage around surveying, conducting environmental assessments, to later stages of installation and also remote monitoring under operations and maintenance. In order to answer this question about what needs to be done more in Japan, we developed this methodology in collaboration with the Renewable Energy Institute, where on the left-hand side, you can see the question of assess the need for action on skills and development. And we approached this by doing a landscape review of the Japanese and key international offshore wind markets. So here we looked at what materials were already available. We discussed with both stakeholders within Japan and internationally. And this gave us a comparative baseline understanding of where Japan is at with its skills journey. And we also compared this with the market situation. A really important piece of work as well, part of this was to understand we cannot assume that even if we have the best intentions and the best policies, that it will go smoothly. There are going to be problems, and we need to understand what sort of challenges and barriers are there for Japan. So we asked stakeholders, what are the current barriers? Why can't we get more people in? Why can't we hire people? Sort of asking those 5 whys of what is the root cause of this issue. And then what is already being done, and when we already have so many actions, what more needs to be done, and who else needs to be involved. And all of this is summarized in the recommendations, where we have very detailed thinking around the short, medium, long term, where we think about the problem from a whole systems approach, and we see the need for a just transition as well. So some of you today may be thinking there is already a lot happening in Japan, and indeed we were also very impressed with all of the feedback and the stakeholder comments. So the government is doing a lot around funding. METI, of course, has published has set out to publish a human talent program. There's a lot happening in education and research activities, and the industry is also setting up facilities and taking action around skills development, as well as incredible amounts of collaboration examples. So the question is, why is this potentially not enough? What more needs to be done? Well, one key shift in the approach that needs to happen is we see the need for a whole systems approach. And so this means that skills is a topic that cannot be tackled in isolation, and we cannot look at it from the center of the offshore wind industry necessarily. We need to look at it as the center of the economy in Japan. And this means that skills is connected to other systems, such as the education system, the economy, the political system. All of these influence and shape how people will be trained. And so we gathered certain tools that we hope many of you today will have a role in your organizations, in your companies. As decision makers, you will have a role in how you can influence skills, because skills is not relevant just for people working in human resources. It is something that we can all shape in our work. So the first tool that I would like to introduce is thinking about how you can play a role in shaping Japan for a just transition. We looked at the just transition concept and we broke it down into 4 steps. The first step is baselining. So as Yoshimura-san was explaining, kind of understanding what are the current numbers of people that are in the role, what are the expected numbers of people going into certain roles, how many certificates are needed, what are the pathways to moving into certain subsections of offshore wind work. We really need to understand what the current situation is, and therefore these baselining activities for each organization, for an educational institution, for government are really important to do. And then this links to the just transition thinking, because the future economy is not going to be the same as the current economy. The future economy that we move into for a carbon neutral society, it needs to be better than the current economy. And therefore, it is not just about looking at jobs from a quantitative perspective of, have we got an offshore wind engineer, yes or no? No, the question is, have we got an offshore wind engineer who is contributing to their community, who has high quality of life and has decent work? And so we need to understand the situation now and then plan for that skills transition and plan for a better economic future. So once we know the current situation, we can feed into the planning and implementing and then evaluating stages. It's very important to have baseline and planning, because we have seen some decision makers jump straight into implementing. For example, perhaps we create access to funding, or perhaps a university course creates a new course. However, without understanding the baselining and planning situations, it may be difficult for students to be attracted to decide to do that university course, because there's another barrier. They're not that familiar with offshore wind. They're not attracted to it. Even if there is funding available for companies to move and get training, the companies may not know what they need to do to train people, because they don't understand the gaps. So you can see how these questions need to be tied together. And then we also need to think about evaluating in terms of, are the goals that we set out to do successful? So another key framework comes from the OPITO framework that was discussed in their skills landscape report for the UK continental shelf, where many of you will know there's a lot of oil and gas work, and there's a question around transferring these people to offshore wind. But there's a very important role here, or question that is applicable for general skills work. And this is about breaking down skills policies and skills actions into specific types of thinking, where, say you are a company and you have your existing workforce on the top left-hand side. You have existing workforce, you have existing skills. If you're very lucky, you have everything you need and you can develop your offshore wind farm project, then your policies and actions need to be about retaining those skills. But let's say that you have existing skills, which is the case in the UK sometimes, but you need more people, you don't have enough people for your project, then you need to look at recruiting people. And in this way, the types of policies will be quite different depending on the specific skills related challenge. Say, for example, if we move to the future of offshore wind skills, you will need new skills, more capabilities around robotics and automation. So on the bottom right-hand side, then you need a new workforce and new skills, and you as a decision maker will be thinking about, how can I renew my capabilities? In addition to this skills-specific thinking, we saw the need for decision makers to work in this whole systems approach way. And how can you do that? We identified these key drivers that really facilitate more collaborative way of working. And that was each organization can have a role in communication. Can they release publications about which areas they want to go in? Can they release publications about the skills challenge to raise awareness, to communicate what they want to do? Education and research has to be very strongly connected between different organizations. So the universities need to be speaking with the industry to understand, are the university courses suitable for the industry? And this also has to be underpinned by collaboration across the different organizations, as you all know. So today it's really to introduce the thinking in the reports that we discussed, and the aim of this is so that decision makers are more precise about their questions, because without the right questions, we will not find the right solutions. So we need to understand the dynamics between, is this an existing industry problem or a new industry? Are there specific geographical shifts across the kind of urban and rural landscape? So hopefully this helps us all think more accurately and more precisely about skills problems. So in the UK context then, and the other 4 markets that we explored, this is just to give you an overview of the structure of some of the market case studies. You can see on the right-hand side, we looked at those whole systems drivers of communication, education and research collaboration, and what examples are happening in these markets. And this is mainly just for inspiration for many of you, not to say that these markets are doing it all right. They're absolutely not. Skills is a challenge everywhere, but it will be good for decision makers in Japan who relate to skills to think about skills and demonstrating skills in this whole systems way. So the reason why just transition considerations are so necessary for Japan is, as Yoshimura-san has kindly explained, that offshore wind is very geographically linked. And so we need to think about how will skills be affected when we have an increased number of wind farms, let's say in the Tohoku region. But let's say that in the Tokyo or Kansai region, that there's a lot of construction and manufacturing capabilities. How are we going to get the people who work in construction manufacturing in the Kyoto, Osaka region to Tohoku? We need to think about the geographical influences. Similarly, you mentioned the workforce. There is, of course, an aging workforce, and we need to think about attracting young people. So there's a dynamic there about the demographics. We can't assume that by 2040 we will have X number of people. We need to understand that some people will be retiring and some young people will need to come in as well. So overall, this multifaceted landscape needs to be considered. Building on some of the thinking, we also have to assume that there are specific challenges for Japan. So in our interviews, as many of you will be familiar with, some specific challenges that came out are this recognition of lack of oil and gas history, offshore wind being a very new industry in Japan over the past few years. And so there's a lot of moving parts. We categorized all of these keywords and put them into kind of 4 barrier areas. So as Yoshimura-san has kindly explained, there is a general labor shortage. So we need to think it's not necessarily just about getting more people from other industries in Japan. If we do that, we realize there's just not enough people. So how can we address the broader labor shortage across all industries? Also, given the lack of oil and gas history, a lot of people have spoken about this concern about not having that history and applying it to offshore wind. And similarly, with net zero or the carbon neutral goal being set in Japan in 2020, this is quite recent. So a lot of companies are not sure exactly how to prepare for carbon neutral activities. And lastly, if we think about transferring people from one industry to the next, that's not necessarily the cultural habits where people are used to working in one job for life. So we need to think about those challenges as well. So overall, and I'm pleased to look at the report, which really details each recommendation, but they are summarized here. So you can see the 5 baselining, planning, implementing, planning, and evaluating. where it's not a linear process between baselining, planning, implementing. You can see we need to go back to planning when we think on the medium term. But essentially, the first recommendation is around baselining in this just transition of how can all the organizations take steps to clarify the current situation on skills development for offshore wind industry in Japan. That doesn't just mean the government and JWPA or wind associations. That also means each company needs to take stock of its situation and capabilities. And thinking then about planning, well, how can each stakeholder communicate its plans in the direction of skills development? People can start raising awareness about they want to specialize in floating, they want to specialize in certain technologies. This planning can help organizations collaborate together. And with implementation, then, of course, offshore wind being a global industry, we need to think about how we can work together on implementation, because we all need to cumulatively create those that amount of gigawatt in the sea. So we need to align with the offshore wind market on skills and how can we accelerate some of the actions and learnings from other markets. And of course, we can't prepare for the offshore wind market of today. We need to prepare skills for the offshore wind market of tomorrow. So we need to take steps in a few years about modernizing and future-proofing skills for the offshore wind industry. And finally, we need to ask ourselves, are these actions successful? We need to think about what does success look like? And we'll be talking more about what can happen if it's not the same idea of success for different organizations. So you can see the first three are focused on the short term, 1 to 2 years, modernizing the workforce is a medium term, 3 to 4 years, and evaluating is on the long term, 5 years. But please do have a look at the details of these recommendations in the report. So that's everything from me. You're welcome to reach out. It'd be fantastic to continue working with you on this subject. And I look forward to discussing more in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosanna-san, for your great presentation. Rosanna-san、ありがとうございました。それでは早速でございます。
Thank you very much. We will go on to the panel discussion. The moderator is Akihiro Sando, Senior Researcher of Renewable Energy Institute. Thank you. Good afternoon. This is the second panel about human resources development, skills and training. I will moderate. My name is Sando. Prior to the panel, there are 3 panelists for the initial remarks. So first of all, from Hokutaku, Executive Vice President Yoshida-san, please.
Thank you for the introduction. As has been introduced, my name is Yoshida from Hokutaku. I appreciate this opportunity today. Thank you very much. First, we are a third-party maintenance provider here in Japan. Well, we don't have necessarily enabling environment for third-party companies to provide maintenance for windmills. The number of windmills itself is limited. That's one reason. And unfortunately, all the windmill manufacturers in Japan have withdrawn from manufacturing of windmills. And so hard for third-party companies like us, and assets are becoming larger. So in terms of conditions for the loan, LTMA, long-term service agreements are being required for the assets that are becoming bigger, and therefore third parties are difficult to be developed. So those are some of the reasons as to why third-party maintenance providers are not having an easy time. Well, we have 24/7 surveillance monitoring center. We partner with universities to provide smart maintenance research. So that's what we do. Providing regular inspection, of course. And our company, Hokutaku's initiative for developing talents, let me share that with you. Well, close to the site, technical colleges, high schools, colleges. We receive interns from such educational institutions nearby to our facilities. And we have a new GWO facility. GWO, as is mentioned, once every 2 years, you have to renew the qualification, and the cost for that is quite hefty. When a local company tries to do this, it's going to be costly. You have to travel from afar. You have to pay hundreds of thousands of yen, and every 2 years you have to pay for that and travel from afar. And so, can we reduce the cost? Is there any way to do that? Then why not have a GWO facility in Fukushima? We constructed a new one in Fukushima, and for training specific to offshore wind. There is subsidy from METI. We're utilizing that, and we're in the process of constructing this. Unlike in Europe, here in Japan, we don't have test sites. For the purpose of training, if we are to build windmills, it's going to take a lot of money, a lot of time. And if we are to do that onshore, there's so much work necessary. So onshore, we have built a transition piece. So the floor will shake and you will be trained to hop onto TP. In Kita-Kyushu, we have this facility. Well, around the world, this kind of facility is rare. TP alone weighs 400 tons, so very heavy equipment. So with this kind of equipment and facility, you're able to have hands-on training, which is close to what you experience on site. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that it's very costly to develop talents. And in order to achieve carbon neutrality, then Prime Minister Suga clearly pointed to a goal, but on the current course, we will not be able to achieve this goal. So the question is how to develop talents. That's a huge challenge, an important challenge. And in order to develop talents, we need test sites onshore to train people. And unfortunately, the government is considering providing lots of subsidies, but timing-wise, it's off. Well, we're on the receiving end of subsidies, and I'm sorry to say this, but actually, timing is not optimal, which is a reality. So, subsidies in line with the right schedule, I do hope that they are provided by way of backing our efforts up. If that is done, that is appreciated. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. I look forward to the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yoshida, that you are cultivating human resources in-house. We look forward to the Q&A as well. Next panelist, may I invite Professor Ikegami, Nagasaki Institute of Applied Science. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. I am Ikegami, Nagasaki Institute of Applied Science. Why am I standing here? I do have a question, but at our university, in the past, it was called the Nagasaki Shipbuilding University. Within Japan, this was almost the sole, only a university dedicated to research of ships and vessels. It was a university only for ships, and I think that is the reason why I have been chosen. As we say in Japan, with the limited time of 3 minutes, I have 5 minutes? Oh, thank you. Within the 5 minutes, I will discuss about Nagasaki. We have created what is called Nagasaki Ocean Academy. What was it? I think I'll find the name later, but There are many organizations. We are trying to cultivate human resources, promoting wind industry. Nagasaki is a particular prefecture that we are focusing on this industry. So please allow me to introduce what we are doing in Nagasaki. In terms of human resources, the university don't really directly cultivate offshore wind people, but hopefully we want to embark upon directly cultivating university students for offshore wind, and we are thinking what we ought to do going forward. First of all, about Nagasaki Ocean Academy will be introduced. Earlier, Mr. Yoshimura discussed about the lack of human resources. It's tens of thousands of people that will be deficient within 10 years or 20 years. But at this Nagasaki Ocean Academy, when we established, this is fully supported by Nippon Foundation, the NPO. Back then, Nippon Foundation also hired a consultancy, and we tried to estimate how much human resources will be required back then. 9,000 persons will be required in the next 10 years. It sounds small compared to what Mr. Yoshimura mentioned. So technicians will be required, like 10,000 or so personnel, technicians, engineers will be required. Nippon Foundation understood the gravity of the situation, and there must be quickly an organization established to focus on human resources. According to data of Mr. Yoshimura, there seem to be lots of facilities across Japan, but we decided to set up something in Nagasaki. So we established this academy. As for the operation, this is conducted by Nagasaki Marine Industry Cluster Promotion Association. This was made 10 years ago. This is a promotion association. So this is the organization Nagasaki to promote renewable energy. So this cluster association is the operator, and Nagasaki Prefecture government and the Nagasaki Institute of Applied Science and Nagasaki University. These are the four parties organizing Nagasaki Ocean Academy. As for the teaching material, training material will be required. And other countries are advanced, like the Netherlands and Denmark. And therefore, from the Netherlands, DOB Academy, we are especially supported by this Dutch organization. Training material, we are supported by Dutch organization. And these are for adult trainees. And this is the business process, and we call it NOAA. Nagasaki Ocean Academy, we call it NOAA. So what NOAA is providing, this is the business process and what the NOAA has to teach. On the left-hand side, this is the steps of the actual project, and then the operators who will be working at a particular stage. And on the middle and the right-hand side, these are the education courses by NOAA. The business process on the left, starting from the selection of the location or the financing, environmental impact assessment, designing, engineering, construction, pilot, operation, and removal, disposal. The left-hand side is the entire life cycle. The corresponding operators who will be involved. Then, in correspondence to that, these are the training courses to be provided. As for the substance, what is going to be trained or taught. So this is the structure. That was a busy slide, difficult to understand, but this is the different courses taught at the academy. Basically, it is according to the DOB Academy of the Netherlands. It is based on the textbooks from the Netherlands, and we have rearranged for the purpose of Japan. There are technology courses, but number 3, this is about insurance and finance. For example, there are lectures also about insurance and finance, A3. For example, there are banks like MUFJ, NK classification, or insurance companies, class NK. There are insurance companies, banks, or certification organizations that we do not have the expertise for. Another big project. Next year, we plan to start the operation of an offshore wind training facility. So technicians with the expertise have been cultivated, but as Mr. Yoshida of Hokutaku just discussed, we need the workforce on the front line, on the ground, the manual workers. So from April 2024, we plan to open a training facility, and the building is almost complete. What I would like to emphasize is number 2. The expertise comes from Maersk Training of Denmark. So we work with Maersk, Denmark. We have a contract with Maersk, and they are kindly training us. And CTV and the offshore tower, that we want to have the vessel, and Hokutaku will operate the ground systems. So in our case, we will have a tower really offshore, and the CTV, the crew transfer vessel, we will actually make the ship and the offshore tower. We will physically use the ship and the tower for the training. In the area of maintenance, the largest number of accidents occur here in terms of offshore tower, that you transfer yourself from the ship to the tower, you get caught by the leg. This is the stage, particular area where there is the largest number of accidents. How many minutes have I spent? 1 minute left. Thanks. And finally, the current situation of our program about how to cultivate human resources, the current situation, and personally, this is what I think we have to do. So at the moment, we simply are lagging behind in terms of offshore development, and that is why we don't have enough workforce. More recently, the central government is working on expanding this industry, so we need more people. In particular, we expect that there will be a huge demand for maintenance personnel. The third point is, of course, we need to cultivate human resources, but there are more younger generation having interest in this sector, but there is overwhelmingly insufficient opportunities to train or learn about this industry. And therefore, okay, I'll talk about this later. Let me use this remaining slide at the panel. This is about what we ought to do. This is my personal observation. So I'll leave this slide for the panel discussion. Thank you for this disorganized presentation. Thank you. I know there's a lot you want to tell us. And of course, you were positively selected for this role and activities. Thank you so much. And next, inviting Professor Ushiyama, Ashikaga University. Professor Ushiyama.
Good afternoon, members of the audience. My name is Ushiyama from Ashikaga University. We're talking about development of talents today. The government and Nippon Foundation Well, I have been serving as a judge on a panel to screen projects in those organizations. And so I would like to provide a somewhat different perspective than those who have already spoke. Well, the specifics were provided by Mr. Yoshimura, and Mr. Ikegami also talked about this. So what should be the ideal state of human resources? That is what I would like to talk about. And as Professor Kanehara said, Japan's EEZ, it's number 6 in the world in terms of the sea area covered by EEZ. And so Japan as well as the UK have an advantage here, having a vast EEZ. And just by utilizing 8% of EEZ, we can have wind farms worth 1,000 gigawatt. And if we are to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, then 10 megawatt wind mills can have to be installed on the order of 3,000, 5,000 units. Huge amounts need to be installed if we are to hit CN. And this was something that was produced by offshore wind team. And Denmark is a rather smaller country, but Germany, in terms of the scale of economy, the size of economy, it's similar to Japan. So let's take Germany as an example. In the case of Germany, already 8 gigawatt of offshore is introduced. And their goal is by 2045, 70 gigawatt is to be installed. That's close to double. That's almost double of Japan's. And Germany is ahead of Japan. And so the size of wind turbine used is still small. They're looking to increase that to 15 megawatt. And 2020, as of that year, 862 companies hired 21,400 people in this industry. We have those specific numbers to attest to their track record. And this is again an example of Germany. They have lots of ports, seaports. But Rostock, as an example, that city has 21,000, which is the equivalent of Aomori City in Japan. And so what is being done? It's been more than 30 years since reunification of the East and the West, but there's still economic gap between the West and the East. And so there are measures taken to simulate the economy in former East Germany, and Rostock is in that area. So Rostock is one of the largest ports in the eastern part of Germany, with a population of 210,000. And what they have done is they have created a museum ship, and the museum ship would visit different ports to show exhibits to demonstrate what an offshore wind farm would look like. And people would know hands-on as to how it works and make them think that it's possible for them to be engaged. And the total number of visitors has exceeded 100,000. And given the population, it's a huge feat. And within Rostock port city, they're going to set a academic course funded by Nordex to provide expertise about wind energy engineering. Well, you have only 1 minute left, so I'm sorry I'm being lengthy. coexistence with the fisheries industry at my university, Ashikaga, 29th and 30th, and it's the 23rd of the 2-day course. In one day, one of the 2 days, we're going to teach existence with fisheries. And Miyahara-san talked earlier, and Kudo-san made a presentation about this last year. We have Nakara-san. And coexistence with fisheries, this is a must that we have to fulfill. And this is proposed by Nakahara sensei, and he's now a professor at Kanagawa University. So please have a look at this later. And Japan, in the past, it says in the title, there were lots of wind turbine manufacturers in Japan, MHI included. Japanese manufacturers used to manufacture windmills and wind turbines. They had know-how and engineers. Well, the automotive industry employing 5.5 million is undergoing transformation. When engines are turned into batteries, there will be surplus of people, and that can be absorbed by offshore wind industry. We need to collaborate. And so I think we can put together a successful supply chain. We utilize people from the automotive industry. And this is the last slide. My main message is here. Watching news reports, media reports these days, I am afraid that Japanese corporations have lost a sense of ethics and morals. I thought that that was the premier strength of Japanese corporations. Japanese corporations have lost it, and so we need to get it back. I'm a program coordinator for Wind Expo. There's a Danish windmill maintenance provider. I invited the CEO of that company over a meal, and not as much as Germany, but Denmark is also accepting immigrants, and they need to find jobs for immigrants. And one of such jobs is to provide maintenance for windmills. And what is important, the Danish CEO said that skills can be taught through OJT, on-the-job training. But what is important is for those very young and talented immigrants to equip them with a sense of ethics until age 26. Unless they understand ethics, they will not be sent to the field. And so that was something that I wanted. All the Japanese CEOs who bowed for their misconduct to hear. And I'm sorry, this is very important, so allow me a few more seconds. What is lacking in Japan is, well, there are lots lacking, but we don't have science communicators in this country. So there are environmental consultants who work for developers and project owners. Well, and they only talk to benefit their masters. Well, if you do this, it will be good for windmills. They're not neutral. But we want people who can speak from a neutral position so that they can be trusted by the general public. And mediators, they are also lacking in this country. Well, when there's a gap, you need someone to coordinate and fill the gap. So we need to have science communicators, technical communicators. So from a fair and a neutral position, they need to speak to the general public. So when local governments invite these people, they ought to be able to speak fairly and from a neutral position. And conscience, in Latin, it's conscientia. Con, the same, and scientia means science. Science, conscience. So to gain a knowledge, but as is described here, amongst the experts, the general public, and politicians, we need to be able to talk with each other with fairness and transparency. so share common knowledge from a fair and transparent perspective amongst all these different stakeholders or groups of people, experts, the general public, and politicians. We need a sense of conscience. There will always be troubles, but what is important is that here in Japan, when we educate children, we always say what is right, what is not right. But there are no right answers, model answers for the problems. Most of the problems are in the gray zone, not black or white. And we need to talk about that. Chancellor Merkel was very good at that. She would appeal to the general public and have the general public understand the issues and said that we need to work together. And that's why she stayed as a chancellor for 16 years. I'm sorry for being long. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. We will start the panel. Thank you for waiting as we invite other panelists to the front. Thank you for coming forward.
Thank
you very much for waiting. Inviting the panelists, please. Thank you very much for joining. We will start panel 2 about skills and training. So we have Rosanna from the UK online, and we have 5. Thank you so much. So human resources development. Human resources for offshore wind, you might think, of course, we need people. But as we have heard from all the presentations, when it comes to offshore wind, for Japan, this is virtually a very new industry. And the root reason why we don't have enough people, the sense of crisis about how to ensure the required people, we have heard from all the speakers. Then, what kind of skilled people are required? What training has to be provided? There are different opinions. So under this human resources topic, if we start talking, there is no consensus as yet. And as the panelists have all told us, there are different aspects. So through this panel discussion, we would like to share about what we need to do and share the sense of crisis and establish our long-term perspective and strategies. And we want to have a more granular understanding and perspective about what to do going forward. All the panelists do have a sense of crisis. So we have an excellent panel of 5. So please allow me to ask the question. In the first part of this panel, I would like to ask about the current status, the challenges, and the bottleneck. It would be delving into a further depth. First of all, Rosanna in the UK. Earlier, you kindly discussed that in terms of offshore wind, there are multiple stages. You broke it down like planning, implementation, evaluation. You told us about the breakdown. And not only the industry, but the economy and the political levels all have to get together and be consulted. Actually, in the UK, how exactly do you do this? Are these all implemented? If you can tell us some practical cases of UK, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Sando-san. And also thank you to all the other panelists where you raised some really important points around science, communicator, and the challenges with actually getting out training sites. For the UK, in terms of tangible examples, something I think the organizations, the government and the industry have been quite good at is creating that vision. So, for example, with the UK government, they have the offshore wind sector deal, which came out in 2019, which presents that intention that offshore wind is going to be a very important industrial area. And so people can then, the education sector, the industry has more confidence. And I think today we spoke about that visibility, how companies, it's expensive for them to train people. So they really need confidence and visibility. In addition to the offshore wind sector deal, we have a lot of industry task forces. So, for example, the Renewable UK Trade Association is very active in this space. But I think Japan is also very good at this. Japan is doing a lot. And no country is doing this that brilliantly yet. So maybe we can talk more about how we can all solve skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. And next, inviting Mr. Yoshimura, JWPA. In the presentation, you discussed that the JWPA is working on policies to create human resources, the roadmap about the numbers of workforce who will be required. And you have talked so much. But Mr. Yoshimura, what would you like to emphasize most, the immediate action required? Can you?
Well, thank you. In the near term, what's necessary? Well, I skipped a few slides in my presentation, but what should be the ideal state of talent development? As Rosanna-san mentioned, we need an overall picture, overall vision. We have yet to come out with a good vision, I'm afraid. And that is why I talked about the roadmap. These are the measures necessary. And in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, we need to implement them. So we need to have the overall outline and framework, a vision, and then academia, industry, and government, by collaborating with each other, amongst each other, utilizing each other's strength to promote measures. Measures should not be done in a fragmented manner. There are some measures that may overlap with each other, so combine them efficiently and effectively to pursue the goals. That's what's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shimura. Numbers were shown, cultivating human resources and transferring people from other sectors. Thank you so much. Then, Professor Ikegami, if I may. So you have discussed about Nagasaki Institute of Applied Science. So human resources, you might think about a younger generation, but not only that, the university and the NOAA, the Nagasaki Ocean Academy, already for working adult trainees and the future training, and about raising awareness amongst even the children level to get to know about this business. Going forward to the students, how would you raise the interest over decarbonization, or what kind of fora place will be necessary? Thank you. On the side of university, at the university, I don't think no university in Japan has a dedicated university course for offshore wind. So my sense of crisis is that overall in Japan, when it comes to marine human resources, there is lack of workforce everywhere. But going forward, what is the direction of offshore wind in Japan? The floating will be the mainstream, which means technically it's going to be even more difficult, which means that there must be little vibration, how to moor. Technologically, floating is going to be more difficult going forward, which means human resources, researchers will be required, but there is not much enough expert people, so advanced human resources who can deal with this very difficult technologies required. So university will have to focus on training and educating such population. Going forward, it may sound going the other way around, but Professor Ushiyama mentioned, but we really have to look at the kids, the children, the primary school, secondary school, high school kids. To this children, we must promote marine education already from the primary school level so that they get to know about the sea, the ocean, what is the meaning, the significance, starting from the primary school. There must be education to advocate so that the future at least could be better. Thank you. Thank you so much indeed. As Mr. Yoshimura mentioned in his keynote, 20 years now, in 10 years, the 10-year-old will be a 20-year-old, a working adult. So thank you for that foresight. So younger generation training, but to not only train a fresh young person, but to transfer people in different sectors. May I ask Mr. Yoshida, for already working adults, I know Hokutaku is very active, but to attract people into the offshore wind, fundamentally, any difficulties, challenges that you're experiencing? What is the difficulty of attracting people to offshore wind?
Yes, thank you for the question. First, we have to create a rewarding workplace for people. And in terms of the sector and the type of job, we want the job to be respected. That's also very important, I think. Engineering shift, of course, with that increasingly from the automotive industry to wind power industry, we want people to come. And I'm sure you're feeling this yourselves, but here in Japan, maintenance fees and wages that are paid to the local workers, they are very low compared to those overseas. I think it's pretty cheap to purchase maintenance. So rather than overseas people coming to work here in Japan, maintenance fees as labor cost is quite low if you can utilize local people. And just because the wages are low, we do not want to have vacancies. So I think we'll have to work to raise wages and make the jobs rewarding enough.
Indeed, in order to attract a workforce, the younger generation or the people working in other sectors, it has to be attractive and to raise the status of the engineers and the technicians. Thank you very much. Then, Professor Ushiyama, earlier you mentioned about science coordinators, science communicators, but about the science communicators, what was the experience which made you think about this?
Well, I provide lessons on wheels on renewables. I visit a number of schools to provide lessons. So a sixth grader Japanese language textbook, Renewables for the Future. I have an article that I've written that's included in elementary school textbook for sixth graders, and I'm asked to visit those schools to give lessons. And when you teach them well, children understand very well. And when children understand well, they will tell their parents. And so educating children is extremely important. And so people who can talk about this properly, well, business people are fine, but sometimes they include too much technical terms. And so you have to use plain language to convey to children. So looking at the situation, well, the developers, for example, would hire environmental consultants to talk to the community, but on the developers' behalf, and then the local community would not like that. So even before a plan is drawn up, we need someone who's in a neutral position that would be welcomed by the local community. You need to designate such a person if you are to start a project. Well, and if you go to REI, you can tap into such resources. People will start to understand. And the local communities may want to learn by themselves. And then the developers may come and talk from their perspective. That's fine. So mediators, when there's a gap or this a difference in opinion, mediators are there to try to fill the gap. And when it comes to that stage, it's very difficult. So start from the beginning. Well, we want a communicator who can tell the fisheries industry people and make them think that they can do this. And in overseas, it's the same. For example, in World Heritage sites, well, we need to work on this to protect this, and you have to work with multiple stakeholders.
Thank you, Professor Ushiyama. We are talking about technicians, engineers, or policymakers, but also communication with the local community, with the resident, equally important. Thank you so much. Due to time management, I wanted to talk about the future requirement and the final message. So may I ask you for your final comment? 2 minutes each. Sorry that it is so limited. So starting with Rosanna in the UK, you're rounding up a comment. So lack of human resources. We know that this is the challenge. Until 2030, what should Japan do? Maybe your suggestion, please.
Thank you. My rounding up comment would be listening to all of the wonderful panelists speak about each part, educating young people, thinking about how to increase the quality of the O&M job, respect for engineers. I ask you to think about how do all of these pieces fit together as part of a whole systems approach, and they all need to be done. I completely agree with all of that. But how can we communicate between each other to agree on the prioritization of what the goal is step by step? So I agree, we need to start educating children from a young age, but perhaps how can we move people over within the next 1 to 2 years? So if we agree on what steps need to come, I think that will help accelerate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you very much. And then Mr. Yoshimura, please.
Well, I talked about this toward the end of my presentation. I think I covered what you asked. So all the stakeholders need to work together mutually with each other, and at the same time cover their respective areas of responsibility. And we need to create an attractive workplace where we can attract people. And at each company level, that needs to be done, of course. Anyone who's participating in a project, from JWPA's perspective, the fact that offshore wind can provide a attractive job and workplace, we need to spread the word. So far, our theme of focus has been to promote wind power, and of course that will continue. But in the next step, we need to cover more specifics and details. Wind power is an attractive job, a rewarding one, and that is something that we need to communicate even more. And 2 days ago in Yokohama City, we had a seminar for windmills and wind turbines. Elementary school children and parents came to look at the wind turbine, and I talked. They asked questions with starry eyes. They were excited. And so we want to cherish that. And 10 years, 20 years from now, I hope some of those children will come to work for our industry. That's our hope. And so we have to do all of that, each one of us. Thank you. By the way, JWPA, you have put together a roadmap. Any specific initiative in the next step? First, well, we have drawn up the roadmap, but that's not the end. That's the start. And we alone cannot do this by ourselves. We need to involve the government as well as industry, naturally, and the panelists who represent the educational world, educational circles. We all need to work together. We need to start right now. That's the next step. Thank you.
As was mentioned by Rosanna, to integrate all the parties and to visualize. Thank you very much. And then Professor Ikegami. Thank you. First of all, after all, human resources, cultivation for offshore wind. So is it the chicken or the egg kind of a discussion? But first of all, there must be the industry who has a strong demand and the need. The industry of the offshore wind, it must be active, prosperous. Then that industry sector will be attractive in the first place. And then people will be motivated, incentivized to be involved in an attractive sector. So on the side of the industry, the demand side, that is required, and there must be an interaction between the human resources development, the education training, and the demand side of the industry. That is my first message. And similar to this idea, to cultivate human resources, business, academia, and the government all have to work together, like making a forum. And then the industry, the private sector, what they can do, or what the academia can do, what the government can do, they can play their specific roles, or the three-party can create a joint forum. Business, academia, government work together, the tripartite. To create a forum for training and education, I think will be necessary. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ikegami. Indeed, the human resources for offshore wind, it has to be an attractive workplace. And more than that, the industry itself has to be attractive. Otherwise, if we think this is a declining industry, no one would be motivated to come here. So industry promotion, that it is coming, that offshore wind is the next area, I'm sure it will attract more people. Thank you, Professor Ikegami. Next, Mr. Yoshida.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity once again today. One thing, talent development takes a lot of time. That's what I would like to say. So you have to allocate so much money and so much time into one individual if we want to develop them. And what is good about Japan? Well, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but there are not a lot of job hopping. There are not many people who transfer from one company to another, appear in the same industry. In Europe, that happens very often. If you have better terms and conditions, better salaries, you move from company A to company B. But here in Japan, we have something close to lifetime employment and talent development, roughly put. Well, European standards and Japanese standards. I think it takes about 20 million yen for one to become a full-fledged engineer and under those standards. And for an SME, when our people are poached, that's a problem. And we need to avoid having double standards between Japan and Europe. I think we need to resolve certification issues so that we do not end up having two sets of different standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoshida. It really takes time to cultivate human resources, and not only classrooms, but as you mentioned, the test site with actual equipment, actual wind turbines, and to train and to create skilled, capable human resources. Was it February, did you say, that you have a plan of the test facilities by 2030 and going beyond about the test sites? So what are you going to do?
Oh, they're not nearly enough. We need a lot more. And we would love to have actual equipment for training purposes in Nagasaki, providing onshore training. Here in Japan, a private company like us setting up a workshop or a training site onshore, it takes a lot of time and money. So I think industry as well as the government need to collaborate with each other to develop such facilities. As I said, subsidies, the necessary amount needs to be provided at a timely point. Thank you.
Last but not least, Professor Ushiyama.
Well, I was reprimanded for speaking too long earlier, but the point that I would like to convey is inclusive of offshore wind power, renewables are a good place to work at. 46 years ago, at Japan Wind Power Society. Right now there's PA, it's a gathering of corporations. We have an academic society for renewables, and I was one of the founders. And there was no major windmill operating in Japan back then. But with conviction, with belief, people will gather. You will be able to attract people. So rather than forcibly try to collect people, be confident in your job, demonstrating what's so good about your job, and then people will come. Well, Japan doesn't need to rely on Tomahawk. What is more important is for Japan to be independent in terms of energy, because that leads to peace. And it's so obvious looking at the world right now. Everyone understands that. So we need that to be understood by everyone. And we're doing a great job. Be proud and demonstrate that. And I'm sure the younger people will notice. I have lots of hopes and expectations for younger people in Aomori the other day. Yoshimura-san, as you know, Professor Honda of Hirosaki University, I had a dialogue with him. And 4 high school students from Aomori High School, they were very enthusiastic about the jobs in this industry during the reception. Well, because it was late, the students could not come, but those high school students, how passionate they were, I was so impressed. And it was worthwhile traveling to Aomori. So the younger generation are watching. We have to be proud in the jobs that we perform, and we need to demonstrate that. And then people will come. You won't have to go out of your ways to collect people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ushiyama, to make the people feel that genuinely renewable is interesting, that it is a nice place to work, that there is a foreseeability of business prospect. Then step by step there will be better attraction, and by 2030 the forecast is that we will not have enough workforce, but starting now, and if we have to have the offshore wind, we will need human resources, so long-term strategy is required, business, academia, government working together. That is the regime and effort required in Japan. I shall have to conclude the panel here. So once again, I would like to express gratitude to our panelists. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Sando, panelists, thank you very much indeed. I had to rush you, but we have to vacate this room by 5 o'clock, and that is why we shall have to conclude. In session 1, we spoke about maritime spatial planning. Time was limited, but there was in-depth discussion. I'm sure that we learned a great deal, and the participants said so. I thought it was technical, but I'm very glad that we chose this program. And about the human resources, I think there is a common aspect. So, of course, business, academia, government, and not just working hard, but the industry has to be attractive, the central government has to do what it does, and then there will be stimulation, human resources, and then the wage will increase. All these are connected and important. In the past, at the Nagasaki Institute of Applied Science, I went to deliver a speech, and there were people with the shipbuilding experience. Shipbuilding technology is very conducive to offshore wind. Within 2 or 3 years, we still have incumbent shipbuilding engineers. So if the industry becomes larger, then it is important that we stimulate such a human resource. If the central government becomes serious, as I've been saying, a 45 gigawatt project and the operation, of course, at the minimum, but that is not at all enough. That is not ambitious enough. The central government will have to be more serious and engage in discussion. Once again, I thank you all for joining us despite your busy schedule at the Renewable Energy Institute. We will continue this kind of symposium, and we will offer recommendation about the central system to expand offshore wind. And in summer and autumn, programs will continue. I look forward to your continued cooperation. Thank you very much.